Thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to talk today about some questions that have possessed me for the past several years, at least since 2001, when I started my pre-dissertation work in South India. In their simplest form, these questions crystallize, I think, into this one. How is it that a specific supernatural deity, in this case a female deity named Mary, materializes into a specific South Indian world? What are the conditions that create the possibility for the practice of such a materialization? How, in the cases we'll be looking at today, is it possible that Mary, the mother of Jesus, a woman who lived 2,000 years ago, enters and manifests in bodies? What sort of agency is located in the people who manifest her? And what sort of agency is located elsewhere? How is this agency gendered? And finally, what lends this phenomenon the feeling of authenticity or the quality of being convincing, and to whom? Lest the poster for this talk mislead you in its depictions of two goddess figures, Lakshmi on the left and Mary of Guadalupe, in this case on the right, standing individually, side by side, rigid, static, though I would say beautiful. Let me say from the outset, there's nothing finished or static about the subject of my talk today, though I hope you'll see something beautiful. Indeed, just as the great historian Susan Bailey has said that there was nothing finished or static about the society of pre-colonial India, there's certainly nothing finished or static about post-colonial India, where things seem to be moving at an ever-accelerating pace. I don't think I need to give the now cliched examples of how quickly technology, neoliberal economies, free markets, and a quickly growing middle class in India have changed people's access to information, connectivity with one another, from the village to the city and back. At a similar pace, my work in South India, perhaps like all ethnographic studies of living people, constantly seems to be growing and shifting from under me. If there's anything constant to be relied upon in this work, it is change. And yet, lest we get carried away on hyperbole about change, there's also a groundedness to what I'll be talking about today. That is to say, there's a history to the geographic area of South India, which is now the state of Tamil Nadu. There's the map, today's map. Nadu, by the way, means country in Tamil, so Tamil Nadu is land of the Tamils or country of the Tamils. This history, lest we think about it as static, is rooted in a variety of people and practices that range from indigenous goddess and warrior cults to Muslim pir shrines that dot its landscape, as well as to the Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical practices we often associate with Hinduism. The practice we find in this landscape that I'll be talking about today is, like many of these other practices, both old and new. It's ever-changing, the nature of ritual. For any ritual, I'm arguing along with Catherine Bell and other scholars of religion, is dependent both on repetition, which lends it stability, and on changed context, or new circumstances of that repetition. These new circumstances or new context for the ritual will always exist, changing, as no two moments are ever absolutely identical. So it goes with Marian spirit possession. Before I embark on descriptions of people and events, first perhaps I should tell you what I do not mean by the term Marian spirit possession. In this context of mainly, not only, but mainly North American ears, the term may conjure up the wrong idea, connotations of Satan, of exorcism. Unlike Euro-American Christianity, the possession practice I'm talking about is not seen necessarily as negative, or usually not seen as negative at all, by its practitioners and devotees. For one thing, spirit possession practices in South India are extremely widespread and do not necessarily connote evil. Good and evil do not operate within the same Euro-American binaries in South India. Gods and spirits are not necessarily held at polar opposites, but rather tend more to be governed by systems of karma. Second, I should acknowledge that we do not know how long Marian spirit possession has been occurring in South India. Certainly Mary has been there since the 1st century, as Indian Christianity is almost as old as Jesus himself. This is Caravaggio's The Incredulity of St. Thomas, painted around 1601. The legends of St. Thomas tell us that this doubting Thomas of Jesus' disciples, Thomas Didymus, or Jesus' twin, sailed to the west coast of India, to present-day Kerala, in 52 AD. having cast lots along with the other disciples and winning India, as we're told in the Acts of Thomas, written maybe as late as 200 AD. He traveled to the Malabar coast to convert the Jews, the Jewish diaspora at that time in Kerala. He's said to have landed in Mazuris, near Kodungallur, present-day Kodungallur. He eventually traveled to Mylapore, which is located on the beach in present-day Chennai, where he met his bloody end, and where his supposed remains are entombed in Santom Cathedral. This is it in Chennai. Historians have more or less agreed that Thomas likely did actually make his journey, first to India and then to Mylapore on the eastern coast, though some historians, like Bailey, caution that the Indian stories about him are actually adaptations of pre-existing West Asian ones about heroes and martyrs. Some historians promote the idea that Christianity in India may have started even sooner than Thomas. Matthias Mundaden, for example, notes that Indian philosophy and myth may have found its way via trade routes. Oh, that's not the trade routes. Here are some trade routes. They're a bit hard to see, but you can see the routes coming down through the Arabian Peninsula across to the west coast of India to what is now on the southern end of it, Kerala. So he argues that these pieces of Indian philosophy and myth may have found their way via these trade routes into the Gospels and teachings of Jesus, and perhaps back again via those same trade routes even before St. Thomas arrived. And so stories of Jesus and Mary may have arrived even before Thomas did. Thomas and Mary also have a special connection. According to the Passing of Mary, which is a text attributed to Joseph of Arimathea, that's hard to see, but Thomas is in the bottom right-hand corner, and Mary is at the top. According to the Passing of Mary, Thomas is the only apostle to see Mary's bodily assumption into heaven. After her burial, the text tells us he was transported to her tomb, where he witnessed her bodily assumption into heaven, from which she dropped him her girdle. And that's her dropping a red girdle down to Thomas. So while scholars argue about the fact and fiction of many of these accounts, we can be certain of one thing, and this is my point, that Christianity in India predates European colonialism by a long shot. Portuguese missionaries arriving in India in the late 1400s co-opted pre-existing stories of Thomas and Mary to suit their own proselytizing ends and mapped onto a pre-existing landscape already full of Hindu temples and Muslim pir shrines and Syrian Christian pilgrimage routes. They mapped their own landscape, their own sacred landscape of Roman Catholic holy shrines. And I could go off on that, but I won't. And so Mary has coexisted along with other gods and goddesses of the subcontinent for almost 2,000 years. What did this religious landscape of the southern part of the subcontinent look like when Christianity did first make its way there? And how might that deepen our understanding of Marian possession? Along with pre-existing Muslim traders and rulers, Tamil Brahmin elites, and the Sanskritic cultures of Nambudri Brahmins and other Malayali landholding groups based, again, in Kerala, pre-colonial India was inhabited by a multitude of peoples and practices. Some scholars have categorized these people geographically in three types. Settled people of the rice belt. So let's see if here's again a map of India, this one dating to 1765. It may be hard to make out, but this is the Deccan Peninsula. We have the Ghats, the mountains running sort of slightly inland from the west coast of India. We have dry inland plains sort of in the center of South India. And then we have our coast. So these three types could be understood to be settled people of the rice belt, very fertile area, martial predators of the dry plains, and coastal fishing and trading communities of the shores. In the early 17th century, Nayakas, or warrior peoples, moved down from the north and further transformed the Deccan political structure, consolidating new states or dynastic centers in places like Madurai, Trichy, Tanjavur, and inviting certain other warrior communities, Kalars, who become important to the story later, and others, new peasant groups, to cultivate the soils. The main point I want to make here, amidst all this intercultural exchange, is this, that the culture and religion of this period was organized around divinities of blood and power. Susan Bailey writes, quote, These were deities who partook of all the passions and uncontained generative forces which colored everyday human experience and could therefore be appealed to in times of specific ills and afflictions. But although many of these power deities were recognized as healers and protectors, they were never wholly beneficent, like some of the region's so-called pure or high gods, and they all had a malevolent side. For example, most of the power divinities had the power to possess living men and women. These states of possession were sometimes invited, in the case, for example, of Samayadis, who use ecstatic trance, who still enact this practice today of using ecstatic trance dancing to induce the deity. And sometimes these states are uninvited, can come as a source of torment and debilitation, which can only be relieved through practices like exorcism. These divinities of blood and power could again be categorized into two groups. The first is the important one, I think, for us today, all of the others too, the Amman group, which include Mariamman, Muthu-Mariamman, Bhagavati, Durga, Kali, and others, and the warrior gods of Muni, Muniswarar, Muni Ayar. While Amman is divine power activated, believed to be Shakti, the visible energy of the divine essence symbolized as female, worship of the Amman goddesses dramatically expanded in South India from the 13th century through the later colonial periods, due probably to these migrant groups coming into the area. Newly patronized cult centers developed, choosing Ammans as their chief deities. Also common in this landscape were Nagas, snake gods of the underworld, and again important to today, Pe Pisasus, who are thought to feed in some cases on human blood. This is so perfect for Halloween, and on the passions of their victims. These Pe, I should add, are usually thought to be the spirits of the untimely dead, people who've died early untimely deaths, often women dying through suicide or dowry death, but anyone who's had an accident, this sort of thing. And finally, each household, patrilineage, and clan had its own Kula Devam, or family god, usually a goddess, who protected the ancestral domain and whose shrine would be a place of power and pilgrimage for the group, even if its members had migrated far outside its original homeland. So the goddess became a source of stability, also a place to come home to, a representation of home even among these periods of rapid change. It was interesting in reference to the second type of fierce Tamil god, the Munis that I mentioned, these fierce warrior gods. It was in reference to them that I first came in contact with a village woman who, at least in my imagination, or maybe in my intuition at that time, would ground the bulk of my work, and ground much of my work actually in the city, although she was a village woman. I was traveling at that time through Madurai, the home of the famous Meenakshi temple, the temple to the goddess Meenakshi, the consort of Shiva, when I met an American colleague working on the god Pandi Muni, one of these fierce warrior gods of the village. She told me about a woman she'd met not far from Madurai who claimed to be possessed by Mary. This woman lived in a village of Roman Catholic Dalits, or former untouchables, and healed many people, she said, Hindu and Christian, who came to her for help, including some women whom she discerned were possessed by Pandi Muni and who needed to be exorcised of him. I should say, just briefly, I had read at this point of Marian spirit possession in one place in Kalpana Ram's amazing book, Mukavar Women, Gender and Hegemony in a Fishing Village. And she has two chapters where she doesn't name individuals or go into individual life details, but she talks about a phenomenon among the fishing caste along the coast of Tamil Nadu, in which women are possessed by Mary, the mother of Jesus. So I'd heard about this happening. I hadn't yet found it myself. And this is Durga, of course. So this is actually this is complicated, but so-called Sanskritic goddess, but often depicted in her fierce aspect, riding the lion and slaying the demon with many arms, etc. And these are pictures of Shakti goddesses they're a bit hard to see, and I'm just going to go quickly, but this is a village near the village of the woman in which I work. This is a Hindu village in which these three small shrines are shrines. First on the left, you can't really see it, it's brown, to Pillayar. And then the center shrine is to Mariamman. And then the right-hand shrine is to Gangayamma. But Mariamman and Gangayamma are both these fierce goddesses and are worshipped. This is Mariamman's temple. But I'm just whipping through these representations of the goddess here in rock form, in the most primeval sort of representation. And this is the goddess by a snake mound or an anthill with a trident representing the fierce goddess stuck in her there on the left. And this is Shivaganga district in Tamil Nadu, where I worked with this woman. And I'm sorry, it's a bit so hard to see her. I don't know if we can dim the lights.
The images look much better here. I wonder if
that might help. Bummer. Sure. Maybe I'll speak about her while we work on the light. I've actually given her a fictional name that is difficult to say. A friend Gabe was like, "Why are you using this name, Dhanamangalam?" I call her Dhanamangalam because it's a bit like her actual name, but I am fictionalizing her name because even though I'm showing you a picture here, I will be keeping her identity. I think I'll be protecting her identity. We can talk about that later if you'd like. But she lived in Shivaganga district, still lives in Shivaganga district, an administrative district that had been carved out of what was formerly the Tanjore kingdom. And I should say the Tanjore king a Hindu had patronized the Roman Catholic Marian pilgrimage site of Velangani quite famously and quite abundantly, and there were these interactions between these Roman Catholic pilgrimage shrines and these Hindu rulers that were very productive. So she lived in Shivaganga, which is primarily agricultural, with paddy as its main crop. This is a photo not of confusingly, not of the village church that I'll be talking about, but of the village church I'll talk about that is the place where Dhanamangalam conducted most of her healings, is a substation of this church. And this church is in Devakottai. And I'll speak briefly about it. But mainly it's to give you a sense of sort of a Portuguese nature architecturally of these churches. And this is a church to Mary. So Shivaganga is primarily agricultural with paddy as its main crop. It's in this rice belt that I mentioned before. 70% of its population is agricultural, and most of its population, more than 70%, is considered rural. Dhanamangalam is an illiterate agricultural worker in her late 40s, now in her early 50s actually, a self-defined Roman Catholic, like all of her fellow villagers. Her village of about 34 huts, when I was doing my work with her, was at that time and still is surrounded by Hindu villages, also mainly Dalit, untouchable villages, but Hindu Dalits, and had been very close to the site, her village was very close to the site of Hindu intercaste riots in 1978. She claimed to be possessed by Mary in the form of Adaicalamada, which is Mary of Refuge. There are many forms of Mary here, as in around the world, and they're named in Tamil. This one is Adaicalamada. She ministered to hundreds of people, Hindu and Christian, who came to her for succor, many of whom would camp out in the village church for weeks on end, seeking her blessing and her healing. The Portuguese-style church that's not here, but the smaller replica of it in the village, built in 1945, stands in the center of the village in a clearing near a well, more the size of a chapel than a church, with a dingy white exterior, pink interior walls, and a pointed wooden beamed roof. The church she worked in, this koil as she called it, koil is often the word used for Hindu temple, ko means king. Koil means the place of the king, the dwelling of the king. So she calls this church the koil. It is a substation of this parish at Devakottai, and the local parish priest celebrates Mass in the small chapel in her village once a month, maybe once a month, if that. The altar of that chapel is many-tiered in the style of many of the churches in the area, and lost my place, and holds many statues, mostly of Mary, and there is no crucifix in this chapel. There are statues of Mary, Adekalamada in particular, who's represented in a particular way, along with statues of certain saints. We sat cross-legged on the cement floor of this chapel when we did our first interview, and we were surrounded by village children and some village women. And when Dhanamangalam spoke of seeing Mary, or Mada, as she called her, as many people do call Mary in India, the volume of her voice fell practically to a whisper. We covered the basic questions. She was married to a farmer, her distant uncle. Together they had one daughter and 3 sons. One of the sons was studying to be a priest. Actually, he's going to be ordained in 2 weeks. When I asked Dhanamangalam to tell me about the first time Mada came to her, this is what she said. When I was 25 years old, Mada came to me. At that time, I had 1 daughter. At that time, I was not well. I didn't know that a pei had grabbed me. I didn't know that my body was not well. We tried the hospital, but my body did not get better. My stomach hurt, my chest was blocked, my eyes were throbbing. I felt some weight on my head. For that time, I was so scared. I felt that someone had come and caught hold of me. It was all like this for me. I prayed to Mada. I prayed for my recovery. I'm staying here itself, or I stayed here itself in the chapel for a week. Before me, a boy and a girl who were not well had come and stayed here too. After I stayed here, I became well. And then I said, how did you come to this coil? She said, when I was thinking to come to this coil, Mada came into my dream. The next day, I came to this coil and stayed. I stayed and stayed here, and my body got better. Mada came into my dream and said, come to my coil. And then I asked her, well, how did Mada appear to you? How did she look? And so she gestured toward the statue on the altar, and she said she was like this itself, the statue of Adekalamada. Because she appeared like this itself, I'm able to say that she is indeed Mada. Madave, calling her. Like that, I was praying, and then she came to me. I was not afraid. As soon as I saw Mada, I felt joy and happiness. Fear did not come. My body became okay. She then told me that because it was pei who had grabbed her, and this is a whole story in itself, but because these pei, she discerned eventually through Mada, were the bodies, or the dead, the spirits of the dead 5 men who'd been killed in these 1979 riots, intercaste riots. They were Hindu men. And they came to her and haunted her day after day, and she associated them with her illness, which was also associated with a miscarriage, which is, again, a much larger story. So she said it was because these pei had grabbed her that a hospital wouldn't heal her, even though she went to one. She left it and was still ill. Only Mada would heal her. Her healing drew others, also possessed by pei. Oh, so she's healed, that's important, right? But then she starts drawing other people who believe themselves to be possessed by pei, at least who know they're sick. And these people would, as they say in Tamil Nadu, dance, loose their hair, often women, and dance in the chapel until Dhanamangalam would drive out the pei. The mechanism of her healing was empathetic. She would have the suffering person kneel behind her, and she would feel whatever pain she said the person was feeling, and in part through that feeling diagnose the pei. When I asked her if she would be at all scared during this process of facing the pei, she said, no, I'm not scared. Mada is there. Pei will also be there. If the pei gives a fight, Mada will say, pick up a broomstick and beat. I will beat the person using the broomstick. I'm going, the pei says and leaves. So what seemed most remarkable to me at this time of the interview was not only that Dhanamangalam claimed to be possessed by Mary, nor that she claimed to heal people while in the state, because I'd heard of such things, but what interested me was the nature of the Mary that possessed her. What also interested me was this. This was not the gentle Mary of sweetness and light who gave birth to a god while somehow remaining a virgin. This was a Mary who got angry, whose virginity did not seem key, indeed whose virginity never entered the discourse. This was a fierce Mary, more like Marian, Kaliamman, etc., or other goddesses of Tamil culture than the poised queen of the heavens who evolved through European history. What also struck me later was the story of the extent, or what haunted me, I could say, for years and continues to, is the extent of her own physical suffering and the real physical suffering of the people who would come to her. And I could go on and tell more stories there, but I won't. But the story of suffering, of trauma and affliction as a moment of being wounded as if by the goddess, or distinctly by the goddess, and then healed by her. This narrative has been noted by many scholars to be a marker of Tamil stories of healing and possession, particularly goddess possession. It's a marker, it seems, of authenticity, a sign of real possession by the goddess in the Tamil religious world. A person is afflicted, struck, or stunned by the goddess, sometimes almost reaching death. The goddess heals the person, and the person harnesses this power of affliction and cultivates the ability to call upon the goddess at certain times and even to heal. So it was with this memory of Dhanamangalam and her story and a strong sense of its structure, including the ferocity of this Mary, that I came to work with two other women in Tamil Nadu who also claimed to be possessed by Mary. Both of them lived in the urban center of Chennai, the state capital, and had achieved some notoriety. They came from two very different backgrounds, both from one another and from Dhanamangalam, and seemed to meet with different levels of success in their possession practices. I'll briefly introduce them, and then I will show a 10-minute video of a television news program that actually did a series documenting and comparing these two women. So first, if it's possible to see a little bit better, this is Rosalind, whom I will name and do name in my work. Her real name, Rosalind. She's a 37-year-old former teacher and a single mother. She lives in the northernmost Chennai neighborhood of Kodungayur, a largely lower middle class area. Rosalind's husband, whom she says is a drunk, left her shortly after she gave birth to their son Frederick. I actually didn't speak to her husband, so that's something I wish, or maybe I will still do, but this is her rendition and her family's rendition of what happened. That he left when she told him she didn't want him there anymore, and she was pregnant with her only son, Frederick. When I met her in 2004, she and Freddie, as they called him, who was then 8, were living in their joint family of 12 in a 2-bedroom rental house. And I say joint family, that's an important term known to folks probably who work in India, but the joint family means that her father and that she lives with her father and her father's brother and their children. So it's a practice of living around the patriarchs of the family. So she lived in this joint family with 12 people. In 2001, she left her business, which she called Frederick Tutorials, when she literally became, you could say, otherwise occupied by Mary. Occupied is indeed the word she prefers, and she uses it in Tamil. Yennai akaramittu kolado. I'm occupied. Because she says, Mada occupies me. Mada, as Mary is generally referred to in South India, reportedly told Rosalind in this occupation that her name in this particular avatar was Jacinto. The name Rosalind later revealed to me, the name, actually, Jacinto in this dream revealed to Rosalind that her name meant Queen of Roses. That was what she understood the translation to be. I later realized that Jacinta is a Portuguese name, often used to refer to the hyacinth flower, and Jacinta is the name of one of the children who claimed to see the vision of Mary at Our Lady of Fatima, at Fatima. But this was not, and I actually later did say this to Rosalind, and she said, oh, that's interesting, but that's not what Mada told me. As you'll see in a video I'll show, Rosalind occasionally uses the word occupied to describe her possession, whereas the other possessed woman I'll talk about, Nancy, uses the Tamil verb root vada, to come, a much more commonly used word in describing goddess possession in Tamil Nadu. It's also the language used by Dhanamangalam in the village, vada, to come. And to come onto, vada male, the goddess, and many spirits are thought to reside on or in the head, or in the hair, depending. Unhappy or malevolent spirits, usually called pe or pisasu, are said to grab or seize the person, pidi. So to use the verb pidi, to grab, often suggests this other sort of possession. At the Jacinto prayer house, which is what it has been called and built up to be, this is it as it was a few years ago. This was once the bungalow that was the family home that they were renting. And the family, after these possession experiences started happening to Rosalind, raised money in their community, created a trust, and bought the house and built this shrine. And the family moved to a different rental house around the corner. In this house, she holds prayer meetings and healing services for hundreds and sometimes thousands of people who come to her for succor. Twice a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays at set hours, she kneels in front of the shrine's altar, and I do have a picture of that. Here is at one stage. You'll see she does have a crucifix. You can see the feet of the crucifix at the top, but then there are two Mary statues, one below the crucifix, one to the right, and then to the left, I believe, is Joseph. So in front of this altar, she will kneel facing these statues and these hundreds of plastic roses. And as the crowd recites her, the crowd sits behind her, and together they recite the rosary in Tamil. Usually by the rosary's third decade, a group of 10 Hail Marys, she removes her glasses and eventually starts rocking back and forth. She takes the hands of two female companions, one on each side, and with some difficulty rises to her feet, usually shaking slightly and bent to the side, as if she were an old lady version of Mary. Squinting and blinking, she cocks her head to one side and wags as if she has a tremor. She is now Jacinto Mada. She leans on a devotee's head sometimes. People laugh as she does this, but there's a real seriousness in the room as well. As she speaks very softly, the fans are turned down, things become quite silent. And she prophesies in the form of what sounds to me like a sermon or a general message, sometimes for long as half an hour, mostly in Tamil. She slips sometimes into English and occasionally into a third language that she claims is glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, which she says is the tongue of the Holy Spirit. Then, aided by one of her female devotees, she walks up and down the shrine's central aisle and lays hands all over the people who kneel to her, asking to be touched. And she pours holy water over them and sprinkles rose petals over them. And after putting her hands all over them and giving them quite a lot of individual attention, she then whispers often messages into their ears. People say that she knows exactly where they have pain, that she speaks directly to their worries, and many experience a sort of relief or healing. The concerns people bring to her range from very much like the concerns people bring to Dhanamangalam. I'd say actually Dhanamangalam's, the concerns people have there tend to be more physical, much more about being ill. Whereas this also comes to Rosalind, but in addition to that, we have a gamut of concerns ranging from the desire for marriage and children to aspirations for social and economic betterment and employment, advancement of various kinds. And socioeconomically, these people do run the gamut and come from, in some cases, very far away, Sri Lanka in some cases. So by the end of 2004, Rosalind was drawing crowds of Marian devotees, especially on feast days, but also twice a week. And she'd become the center of some controversy among Roman Catholic Church hierarchy. Local bishops and priests banned their congregations from attending her services, and this ban may have had the opposite effect than what it was intended. More people seemed to come after the ban than had been coming before. And there is a sort of productivity to this banning and sort of opposition that we could speak about later if you'd like, that I think a lot about. But I actually went away for about a month, came back, and when I was back, I said, hello, what have I missed? And she said nothing, and then we talked more, and then someone in the family said, oh yeah, you missed this television show. And I said, television show, like what? And she said, yeah, this news station did a series on comparing me to this other woman, Nancy, who lives in this other part of Chennai. And I was like, Nancy, who's that? And she's using our name, Jacinto, and she's performing this similar thing. But she waved her hands, But the family had actually, with a handheld recorder, video recorded the TV station, and that's what I have a copy of that I'd like to show. Okay. So I think that the video actually, I hope that it is evocative or has brought up questions that you may have about what's going on here, what more background I could give you, but I maybe just should offer a one-paragraph coda as to what has happened since this time. That I'm basically arguing that each of these three women and other women and men, actually, there are some men who perform this spirit possession by Mary, but they're rare. That they're all handling, they've been dealt a hand, so to speak. They find themselves in particular social locations. They are more or less convincing in some ways, depending upon their social location, the hand they've been dealt, and how that context is read by other people and the place that those other people, the social location that the readers are in, from priests to lay people. But they've dealt their hands quite strategically, I would argue. And to return to the beginning of my talk, the locations of these women remain somewhat difficult to analyze because they're also changing as we speak today. For Nancy, or Mary, depending on where you place the agency, managed to orchestrate her marriage to a much better partner than the one her parents had in mind for her when she first got possessed, and now has a daughter. Donna Mangalam, now in her early 50s, has successfully not only married off her own daughter, but as I mentioned, she'll see her son ordained in 2 weeks from today. She's also facing more social pressure than ever before due to newcomers to her small village, migrants who want access to the village's scant water resources. She recognizes their desire for water, but with her own husband and her son-in-law away on migrant labor, she feels more exposed and vulnerable and afraid to stand up for the new incomers to say they should have water, and she's also stopped her possession practices significantly out of fear of more sort of threats from them. And Rosalind, last time I saw her, was consecrating the Eucharist as Mary. So who knows what tomorrow will bring. But I'd be happy to take questions and the little time we have left, any questions you might have.
For those of you who can stay, we do have a little time for questions about this fascinating and confusing practice.
Hi, how are you? How are you? This may be something that, now that Noah's your colleague at Carleton, he might have already raised with you, but I'm curious about if you found some of the jinn possession in like Sunni Muslim villages as interesting attractive points. Because when I hear this, and more of the Shia traditions that I work in, they look like two very different sorts of phenomena. So the Fatima coming to you in a dream is very common. For example, women will explain, for example, if I had a woman who identifies as lesbian saying that it's because of this dream I had with Fatima. And Fatima comes and helps women come to decisions which are seen as socially problematic often. But the idea of physically being possessed, that second visit versus being occupied, is something very different, and that it would be seen as, so the Janus Bodhi, that's why I thought maybe Noah was raised you to the Sudan context.
No.
That there is the same kind of thing where people are possessed, and a lot of it has to do with like negotiating fertility issues or gender hierarchies, although the women very much look out of control in a way that I think that you're finding you're reading your women as having some kind of intention. And I just wondered if you looked at those as sort of a comparison point, because at least in the Sudanese context, it looks like, or it feels like, or at least the anthropological work has been done, that's not so like strategic and not so intentional, that it is actual.
Well, actually, Kaiti is here from my class, and we actually read Janice Body's book on Tsar spirit possession, and she. So I do see real parallels with the Tsar spirit cult that she's writing about, and it's a very important point that you make. Again, sort of differentiating the visitation and the having a dream. Differentiating that from full body possession. There's, as I've pointed out, there's a strong history of this possession in India, and there is also a history of that in Sudan, and I'm not an expert on it, but it would be really interesting to sort of a next step maybe compare. I mean, I've been trying to do some of these comparisons myself, but I mean, one thing I like about Bodhi's argument about the czar spirits who possess these women, and these women in Bodhi's book are sort of staging these possessions and raising money. Their husbands have to support their possessions and actually sort of throw a party for the spirits to reveal themselves and for these possessions to go on. And basically, Bodhi's arguing, unlike I Am Lewis, the famous sort of guy who wrote about spirit possession, and basically argued that spirit possession was this practice that was sort of a peripheral subculture that doesn't really have any efficacy in the world. It's sort of like a steam vent for women who are oppressed, but it doesn't really do anything. Bodhi is actually arguing that this zone of performing possession gives women in the czar spirit cults space to reimagine their social situations and discuss them even sort of via these characters, like the way we might go to a movie and then go talk about it and sort of figure out our lives. That's also something that Bodhi's arguing is happening there. So yeah, there are definitely parallels, and I think, but I'm no expert. But is there more you wanted to say maybe about that?
I think no would probably be a good thing.
Yeah. It's funny he hasn't yet talked about it, but yeah, but great.
I mean, it's similar but different.
The other really important thing, though, about mentioning the jinns and that these Islamic dargahs and pir shrines that are also all around South India are places where somewhat similar, I would say, forms of exorcism are being conducted, but with significant differences also. Yeah, and there is Marian's a case of Marian possession, I believe, in is it Cairo in Egypt? I feel like anyway, that's another.
Thank you so much. This was really good. And my question has to do with, so at Carleton I was a psychology major, and so we studied a lot about like possession, and almost right away it was classified as some sort of mental illness. And so I thought it was interesting that in a lot of the examples you used, there was a connection with being ill. And so my question has to do kind of like, how has this work kind of influenced your perceptions on like both reality and like normality? And there's probably no answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. My grasp on reality is very, so it's maybe increased that a little bit more. But no, I think it really has helped sort of shake up in some ways my grasp on reality, but also clarify it in ways that sort of stabilize my own sense of reality, and that it's really helped me see how different people's realities are formed very much by the cultural climate and landscape and the stuff that they come up against and the other people and bodies they come up against and what languages they're speaking and what sort of worlds people assent to believe together too. And I think that helps me in many ways sort of understand possession and many forms of mental illness sometimes too, as not necessarily illness but as different understandings of reality, or people whose experiences often often because of their social location, what they've been born into, sort of presents to them a different kind of reality than one that many of us may understand because of the people we've bumped up against and rubbed elbows with and become normalized with.
From Coimbatore, that region. So
Okay.
I was kind of aware of this particular controversy that was taking place at the time.
Between these two women?
Yeah, between these two
Okay.
women. It's very interesting to watch this. But my concern is how do you kind of really plot through this complexity? what's the strategy that you apply in trying to, bring these women out of the social locations that they are in? That's so complex. To form, come up with substance in terms of possessions. That's one question. The second question is, if you move further on to like Salem and other places, the second part, the warrior gods, that's very common. You're referring to, like for example, Michael and Muneshwaran is a kind of a common, angel Michael, and almost like it's obvious that sometimes in the annual festivals, they are really deity powers that are crossovers, literally. Muneshwaran would be someone who would kind of take on the evil, the power. And Michael would be someone who would be, defining the evil spirit and finding that you are possessed by evil. And then the whole lot of people kind of form a group and they drive them toward that. So there's one particular village that has literally, I don't know whether it is, which direction it is placed, the statue of Michael, and then either at the entrance, or I think at the entrance or the end of the village somewhere, but they do literally face each other. So these, second question relates to the deity powers crossing over, literally. They kind of almost like support each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not, it's not.
They help constitute one another's realities.
They're not in opposite polarities, actually.
Yeah, not necessarily,
And actually, most of these villages who come for these annual festivals are also Hindus and Christians, and all of them, and they don't really, in their kind of such a fluidity that kind of in India, especially in the religious spectrum. That's another question that I have.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those important comments. I mean, they help flesh out much more some of what I was trying to say. But I think the first question, which I think was something like, how do I plow through? I think you said the complexity, it's incredibly difficult, and it's tempting to, and I've been exploring stylistically, and I'd say methodologically, in terms of how I communicate knowledge. I've been exploring the use of more fictional techniques to sort of create, to try to sort of create, to have a world materialize for people, for readers, that sort of contain this complexity in a better way, I think, than a kind of delivery that's point 1, 2, 3, sort of analytically, because it just doesn't capture this complexity that you're talking about, psychological complexity, material complexity. But then the second thing you said about it's wonderful, the point about Muniswarar and Michael, and absolutely, these, among many Hindus, especially in the villages you say, but also in Chennai, and among Christians too, there's this fluidity, there's this sharing of worlds. There is, however, and I just feel like it is important to say, I wish I hadn't seen this. I want to talk about fluidity and everyone getting along, and but at the same time, there is, I think, especially in these possession performances, both Hindu that I've seen and Christian, definitely sort of opposing, a sort of reifying of certain boundaries, it seems, as a need to name, contain, and cast out what is deemed to be an invader. So, yes. Yes, so Muni, who by many people may be seen to be a fierce warrior god, but embraced as a god whom you worship, and whom you celebrate, and maybe your family god, or, that same Muni, Mada Dhanamangalam might say in her village, you're possessed by Muni, and she'll beat you till Muni runs away. So that's also happening. Yeah, but very important to plow through it is certainly a task.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I am Italian. I grew up in a Catholic country, so I know very well all these Marian processions, and there are still many of these cases going on in Italy. And every year there is a new woman possessed by Mary, and every year there are hundreds of people following them, and every year from the Vatican they say, no, what are you doing? This is wrong. This is not really, this is not really true. So for me it's extremely interesting, the relationship between the mainland Catholic Church in India and what is happening with these women. Considering their class, it's very, very tempting to talk about individual empowerment of these women.
Yes.
Very tempting.
Yes.
But as a sociologist, I also want to look at the post-colonial response of this new movement, let's say the charismatic movement, and I see them, because this is a Catholic charismatic.
Yes.
This is how I see it.
Yes.
And this
You see Marian possession as a Catholic charismatic practice?
Yeah. For me, it's a kind of a charismatic movement within the Catholic Church.
Okay.
Very interesting is the fact that they speak in tongues, and this is typically Pentecostal.
Yes.
So when you talk about fluidity here, I see that
Yes, there's that also.
there is
Definitely.
everything here, and I see this kind really a response to the mainline Catholic Church, and I see it as a resistance, because the more the Catholic Church say no, this is not allowed, the more people follow them. So it's a kind of an act of resistance, and here I see an agency, a social agency acted through the spiritual power of women. So this is very interesting for me, but I'm wondering if there are any recognized Catholic charismatic in India.
Yes, absolutely. Are there any particular individuals? Right, is that your question? Sort of famous?
Famous women Catholic charismatic, and how they recognize them. Why? What are their features?
Interesting question. I mean, I'm not, perhaps you could help with this question. I know there are famous male charismatic figures on television, running huge worship services with thousands of people. You know, I saw this out in the dunes off the coast of Kanyakumari, and I saw it in Chennai in huge halls. But they're men running these. Now, that's not to say women don't play a very important role in the charismatic movements in various ways. Actually, Judith's work is very much on this. But the fame doesn't necessarily spread to the women, not that I'm aware of. And that might be another moment. This is a moment for agency of a certain kind, for being acknowledged in a certain way, and having more potential to affect other people's lives and to affect one's own life in significant ways. But there's no question to me that both Nancy and Rosalind have been, still are incredibly activated by the Pentecostal movement, the charismatic Catholic movement, and Dhanamangalam. There were those water issues I was talking about in her village, in which she's sort of slowed down a bit. But the other thing that has slowed her down is that it's safer for her to do this too. She's been sort of going off more to the charismatic services that the church, the father in Devakote, the church I showed, he's running these charismatic prayer services, which are also drawing hundreds and hundreds of people out in these villages. And she's going to that, and that's sort of safer, more fun, but connects also with the Mada in some ways, which I could go into another time. But yeah, but thank you so much for that. I didn't realize that this was so common in Italy. I mean, doesn't surprise me, but yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great.
Maybe, would you like to go first? Or then?
Yeah,
Or
maybe
we-
we could take both questions,
yeah.
because we probably only really have time for one, but maybe we'll give you a
Sure.
choice of.
Integrate.
I didn't entirely understand with regard to the television program, which was basically spiritual, it was challenging, it was debunking. What was the effect on the woman? What was the effect on her family? What was the effect on the acolytes or the followers? And then I wondered a bit about the socioeconomic status, origins of the fellowships of these charismatic.
Keep that in mind.
Yeah, let's just.
Yeah, I was curious about sort of what your fieldwork experience was like on the ground, because it seems like these communities are often sort of isolated. It may have been difficult to access in some ways for someone who's, basically Western, sort of going in. I just, wondering if you have mind to speak to that a little bit, and maybe how that sort of, you're integrating that and how you're writing about the experience.
Yeah, thank you. Be happy to talk with both of you also afterward and in person. I guess just in order of the questions, yours was about the socioeconomic, the fallout of the television show. What sort of effects did it have? Yeah. Again, well, it's interesting that you were aware of these television shows. Obviously, it lent these women notoriety, but circumstances in Nancy's life at the time of this television show were changing radically due to this sort of, it's complicated and it's a long story, but Mada, as Mada was possessing Nancy, was telling her parents and negotiating with them really about her marriage. And there was other stuff going on too, but that was a personal thing that was happening, and things moved fast around that issue. So the television show may have played a role certainly in her finding the husband she eventually married. But I don't know that for sure, but I'll certainly ask her that question. And as for socioeconomics, you asked about the people who come for healing. They range the gamut, but they are significantly lower class, and lower middle class. But they are also wealthy people who will show up, and clergy will show up. Yes, the village woman is a Dalit woman. Nancy's a scheduled caste, so yeah. And Rosalind is a higher caste, but not high caste, but a higher caste person.
I think we'll let the two of you take up the fieldwork questions.
Yes,
which
we
might
will.
be more
Yes,
extensive. But thank you all for coming, and thank you for
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.